Chapter 6. Before Matt even opened his eyes, he knew that something was wrong. The quiet stillness of the lake had suddenly been replaced by the loud roar of a river at flood stage. As he sat blinking in the darkness, Matt could hear the chattering of his teeth and feel the tips of his ears stung with the cold. Cold, he thought to himself. Why is it so cold all of a sudden? When he was finally able to focus his eyes, he saw Tony and Hooter sitting across from him, with Katy on the floor at their left. He turned to see Q sitting beside him in the boat. Boat! He cried. Matt cried. We're in the boat. How? How did we get here? And it's snowing. How can it be snowing in September? But his question went unanswered as the roar of the river drowned out his feeble cry. He and the rest of the horrified crew clung to the sides of the boat as it rushed down the swollen river. The little craft dipped and dived, dangerously crashing into large chunks of ice. Matt wondered if he could help to steady their course with his oar, but he was too terrified to let go of his hold on the side of the boat. Everyone, down to the last man, was holding on for dear life. The only lady aboard, however, had other ideas. Matt looked on in horror as Katy tried to stand up in the middle of the boat. The current was so strong and the river so deep and choked with ice that Matt knew if his sister were to fall overboard, she would probably never survive. Hooter must have been thinking the same thing, for at the exact moment that Matt lunged forward to reach for Katy, Hooter did the same. With the sudden shift in weight, the old rowboat veered sharply to the right. Hooter and Matt fell over together onto Tony. Everyone was yelling, trying to untangle themselves. It wasn't until they'd finally sat up and looked at the empty space in the middle of the boat that they were all stunned into a deathly silence. Matt was the first to break it. Katy, Katy, he screamed, wild-eyed into the night. Where are you? But the only reply was the roar of the river and the crash of the ice. Their boat had come to an abrupt stop as it sat lodged between two thick ice floes. The snow had been falling, was mixed with freezing rain, but Matt took no notice. Please, Katy, answer me. Where are you? He cried, leaning over the side of the boat. They all took turns calling her name and waiting for an answer, but none came. They sat for a long time, dazed, unable to believe what had happened. Meanwhile, the freezing rain lashed their faces and soaked through their sweatshirts. Q was the first to notice it. We've got to get out of the ice jam or we'll freeze to death, he called to Matt, but Matt was too distracted to hear. He was desperate to see some sign of Katy. He knew that if he could just see her, he'd jump out of the boat and save her. He wanted to jump out now, but the visibility was so bad, there was no telling where she was. He felt as if a sea of blackness had swallowed her up, and the thought of his little sister struggling under the icy water was more than he could bear. He sat unable to move, paralyzed with fear and grief, watching the tiny beam of Q's flashlight in the darkness. His eyes were filled with tears as he buried his head in his hands. He thought of his mother and how he would have to tell her what had happened to Katy. He thought of his father and could see the look of disbelief and pain in his father's eyes. Katy, please don't be dead. Please, Kate. He sobbed, and once he began crying, he couldn't stop. Hooter traded seats with Q and put his arm around Matt. It's all my fault, It's all my fault, Matt cried. Come on, Matt. It wasn't your fault. It was an accident, Hooter tried to console him. Meanwhile, as Q moved over to Hooter's seat, his flashlight shone on the side of the boat. In the glow of the flashlight, he and Tony both noticed the cracked white letters next to Hooter's seat. Q held the light over the inscription as Tony read it aloud. Emmett Levart. They looked at each other and then back at the inscription. Levart Lake, Tony whispered. That's what my grandfather was telling me about the lake being called Levart Lake, he said. The mystery of the lake was somehow tied up in the name Emmett Levart. But the wind had picked up and Tony's words were lost in a gale of freezing rain as he traced his frozen fingers over the chipped letters. Chapter 7. Suddenly a loud crashing of ice could be heard, along with the muffled voices of men. When Q turned the flashlight in their direction, the sight that met his eyes could not have been more welcome. Matt, look, it's Katy. It's Katy. She's on that ice over there. And look, she's alive, he yelled. Matt, help me, Katy cried. I'm over here. As Matt wiped his tears from his eyes and looked toward the beam of light, he was overcome with relief, for he could just make out the figure of his little sister and could barely hear her cries that were lost in the roar of the river. She was stumbling about on an ice floe that had come to rest alongside a large wooden boat. And at that moment, the flashlight batteries gave out and all was darkness again. She must have landed on the ice when she fell out of the boat, Matt exclaimed. She's alive! She's alive! He was laughing and crying at the same time as Hooter and the others whooped for joy. And there's another boat, Q cried. We can all be rescued. Help! Help! Tony and Hooter cried out in unison. They could hear voices getting closer. We're coming, Katie, Matt yelled as loudly as he could, but their cries were met with a sudden silence. Then out of the darkness a deep voice commanded, Halt, in the name of the Continental Army. Halt, Tony whispered. Is he kidding? The Continental Army? Did he say the Continental Army? Q asked, wiping the sleet off his glasses. Everyone in the boat was peering at the direction of the voice. When Matt suddenly sat back in a seat, he had just gotten a glimpse of the long wooden boat as it nudged its way between the ice floes. Huddled in the craft were a group of men in tattered clothes. Some were wearing tri-cornered hats, and others had rags wrapped around their heads. Their faces were raw and weathered, and they were each clutching long guns in their rag-covered fingers. Matt breathed a sigh of relief as he watched a tall man in a dark cape reach over the boat's side and pull Katie from the ice floe. He quickly wrapped her in his thick cape and handed her to one of the men beside him. Matt was so overcome with relief that he was unable to talk, even though he had wanted to call to Katie and let her know that he was there. As he stood staring from the old rowboat, Matt couldn't take his eyes off the man who had rescued her. He was a tall, imposing figure in a blue and buff uniform. Matt had the strange feeling that he knew the man, for his figure was unmistakable, with his white hair rolled on the sides and tied in the back with a ribbon. His face was strong and proud. It was the face of a leader, the face of a determined man. His eyes stared straight into Matt's, as if one commander had recognized another. All of Matt's courage to speak. It took all of Matt's courage to speak. My sister, is she all right? The child is alive. No harm will come to her. Who are you? Matt stammered. General George Washington, leader of the Continental troops, came the firm reply. Is this some kind of joke, right? Matt mumbled. The general was not smiling, however, as the wind lashed the freezing rain and snow all about them. You had better explain what business brings you out on the river this night, and whether you be friend or foe to the revolution. The general called above the roar of the river. He doesn't seem like a crazy man, Matt thought as he observed the fierce determination on the general's face. Matt looked at the faces of the other soldiers in the boat. They didn't seem crazy either. They looked serious, dead serious, as they held their muskets at Matt and the other members of the club. Are we on television? Hooter started to smile. Is this totally hidden video? They speak queerly, sir, and their dress is foreign. An officer in the general's boat spoke up. They could be spies. The general nodded. Where do you make your homes? He said. Rumson, Matt called back. Rumson, Nebraska. Nebraska? Where is this place, Nebraska? The general said. The general and his men looked perplexed, but the state of their confusion was nowhere near that of Matt and his friends. I never met anyone who didn't know where Nebraska was, Hooter mumbled through chattering teeth. Where do you think they're from? Tony stammered. I don't know, Matt whispered, staring at the soldiers and their muskets, but I have this strange feeling like we've seen them someplace before, Q concluded. Where? Hooter wanted to know. Where have we seen them? In our history book, Q whispered. We've gone back in time. You mean before TV and stuff? Hooter asked, looking at the old-fashioned muskets that were pointed at them. Before TV? Q squeaked. His voice always turned into a series of squeaks when he was excited. Try before electricity and flashlights. Try 1776, the Revolutionary War. That's why they don't know where Nebraska is, Matt exclaimed. In 1776, there was no such state as Nebraska. How did this happen? And if we really have gone back in time, how are we going to get home? Everyone stood staring at the boat full of ragged soldiers before them. Tony turned to Matt. You thought my backyard was so boring. I hope you're happy now. Matt was too stunned to reply. It was true. The Adventure Club had been his idea, but he never dreamed it would turn out like this. Matt closed his eyes tight, wishing they could go back to the safety of the few hours ago when his life had been normal and safe, and his biggest problem had been to finish the peas on his dinner plate.